So I think that should be our slogan for Google Analytics. It's so easy to use, even a product manager could use it.
I
what do you
think?
think?
I think we should go all the way and say so easy to use, even Rahul can use it. And then,
and that'll just be out there for the entire internet.
Companies around the world will all look at Rahul and they'll be like, there you go, dude.
Yeah.
You're a new GA guy, right? So I think it's clear to everybody that in this modern ecosystem of game development, one of the most important things you can do is ensure that your game runs across tons of different form factors, different screen resolutions, different types of memory profiles, GPU characteristics and whatnot. And this is a problem for all of us, right? I mean, you have to figure out how to write your code once, but yet distribute it to hundreds or thousands of different configurations of devices. And that gets really gnarly. Anyone had that problem before? Or is it just me? One dude. Someone find him a t-shirt. See, the rest of you wish you raised your hands. Yeah. Anyhow, up next to describe a little bit more how to solve this problem at its core level with some amazing technology that you're going to love is Neil and Lucas. Big round of applause.
Hi, everybody. Great to see so many people here today. I'm Lucas Bergstrom. I'm the product manager for Google Tag Manager. And we've got Neil Rhodes here as well, who's the tech lead. And I think we've talked a lot about measurement so far. We talked some about advertising. We're going to talk about something a little bit different now. So we're going to talk about not just kind of measuring what's happening or trying to advertise to get people to incentivize behavior or tell people about things that you're interested in. But we're going to talk about kind of the core behavior of your app. Like, how is your app configured and how can you control that? So I think we're all familiar with the App Store model, right? You build an app, you hopefully get it through review, you get it shipped out to people, and with any luck, some reasonable number of people will upgrade to your newest version at some reasonable time. In the web world, we're used to something a little bit different, right? We're used to rapid iteration. We're used to being able to ship something, and then if we notice that something isn't quite right, we can update things live, and people who are visiting our site will instantly see those new changes. And so that's why people get addicted to things like analytics on the web, right? Because they can tweak knobs and dials to improve outcomes and instantly see how that gets reflected. And that has a lot of really positive outcomes in the web world. We're big believers in using real-time data to allow you to have like a really tight feedback loop, right? That's harder in the app world, right? Once you ship something, you're stuck with that until you can convince people to install a new binary, right? So pretty much, once something is shipped out to the store, it's set in stone, and what you're measuring in the app, right? The configuration of different values, right? So maybe like, what the text of an in-app promotion is, what the text of a button is, or, the frequency of in-app promotions. All that stuff is kind of locked into code and shipped along with a static binary. So, how does this work in practice? You'll notice that this leaves out a very important part, which is the actual development process of getting a new binary out the door. Let's assume that your guys' development process is pretty much perfect, right? You're agile, you're hyper efficient, you always ship stuff right on time. Despite that, however, in order for you to kind of get changes out, you need to, get the binary built, get it approved in the App Store, and then you need to actually get people to install that new version. And even if everything goes perfectly, that means that your feedback loop, your ability to kind of make changes, is a lot longer than you would like it to be. And this affects not just developers, but anybody whose work ends up in the app. So let's say that you're a marketer or a business analyst who's putting together promotions, right? And you're trying to figure out what's the most kind of effective frequency of showing in-app promotions, right? What kind of wording is going to get people to convert the best? You need to, basically ship that along with a new binary, and so your ability to kind of tune stuff, measure the effect of that, and then go back for another iteration is severely limited. So the solution is what we're calling Google Tag Manager for mobile apps. And Google Tag Manager, the name comes from the web version. The web and the mobile version have one principle in common, which is separate out your configuration from your code, right? So the code has to stay static for app review, but the configuration can be dynamic. That can be controlled by Google Tag Manager, and that gives you a couple benefits, right? It means that by decoupling configuration from code, you can make changes to things like, what am I measuring, right? What do I consider most important? Or, what is the placement of my in-app promotions, right? Where do they appear in my user flow? Where do they appear on the screen? How often do they appear? What's the wording, right? All of that stuff can be controlled without shipping a new app version, which means you can push changes as often as you like just by clicking Publish in Google Tag Manager. And this affects not just developers, but as I was saying, anybody whose work ends up in the app. So your marketers and business analysts who are trying to optimize stuff that happens inside your app, using Google Tag Manager and decoupling configuration from code lets those marketers do all that stuff without bugging you, right? So suddenly they've got a much tighter feedback loop, a much tighter and faster iteration and improvement loop, and you're freed up to actually work on feature work because they can get stuff done without you. So I'm going to ask Neil to come up right now and explain to you how this actually works.
Thanks very much, Lucas. So as Lucas described, what we really want to do is separate the configuration from the data. And one thing I want to make clear, Google Tag Manager for mobile apps has been out since mid last year, right? Although I am pleased to say that we have a brand new feature we'll be talking about in shortly. So you can really configure virtually anything, right? What you basically have are key value pairs. What sorts of things can you configure? Anything really you can code. You can configure ad settings. How often am I going to show ads? How often am I going to show purchases? Where do those ads appear, and so on. Any network communication that you're doing, you might want to configure that, okay? What host names are you talking about to? What are their timeouts? Gameplay values can actually be configured if you'd like. You can configure content of any URLs you might use for help or so on. Any UI settings, locations of particular UI elements, their colors. Even your localized text can be done via configuration. And any sort of announcements you want to make to users. Here's the basic way I think of it. Currently in your application, you probably have a lot of constants, all right, that hard code how your application works. So as software developers, we don't actually hard code values and have 2s and 3s and magic numbers in our code. We do have constants. The problem is to change those values, you need to recompile your app and redeploy. By moving from using constants to instead using a more dynamic key value pairs, you get this dynamism, okay? What we call highly configurable application. So you use a Google Tag Manager container, and once you've initialized that container, you can get the current value of a particular key. As an example, and this is just a simple example, we have here on the left a configuration where we're setting, using JSON, 3 values: the text for the register button, the text for the try button, and also whether the try button is on the left or the right. And we can see as it's configured on the left, we have a try button on the left and it says register on the right. If we change that configuration, it changes the values of those buttons and also the order of those buttons. Now, did you have to write code for this? Yes, you had to actually write code to go get those values and apply them to the buttons. So change the text of the buttons or reorder. But once you've done that, you have a highly configurable application. You can imagine most parts of your application you suddenly make dynamically configurable. How does this actually work in practice? Well, what you do is first, of course, you make that application highly configurable, and then you publish that application. Then you go to google.com/tagmanager with your web browser, and you edit the container. You basically provide new key value pairs with this JSON, and that gets stored within GTM in the cloud. Your application, as it's deployed to the user, has been built using the Google Tag Manager SDK, and it has many of these, it has calls to load the container, and then it has calls to get container values, okay, so to get those key value pairs. What happens is that the SDK will periodically poll up to Google Tag Manager to get the latest version of the container. Okay? That's by default every 12 hours, but it's up to you. You can also make explicit calls to refresh more often. That container that gets downloaded gets then saved with your application. And what's important to realize is that when you make a call to get a value for a particular key, it's not doing something weird like going actually up to the network to try and find that value. Instead, it's using a cached version of this latest container and then evaluating that value, giving you that latest value. What happens when you first start your application, though? Right? Let's say there's no network connection when the user uses it. How do we get this container? The way we solve that is that you actually provide a default container that ships with your application. We can think of that as the container of last resort. So that gives the default values for each of your keys, and then those can be overridden by editing the container and publishing a new version. So what do you need to use to get started? You could go to Google Tag Manager and create an account. You create a container. You download the SDKs. So this works for both iOS and Android. Currently, there's a Google Analytics Services SDK that combines both the Analytics SDK and the Tag Manager SDK. And coming very soon, both Analytics and Tag Manager are part of the Google Play Services SDK, which contains the APIs for almost all of the Google products. Then you modify your app to use the SDK. Okay, let's look at what that looks like. You initialize your container. When you initialize a container, you provide two important pieces of information. One is the container ID, and that's provided when you create the container. And the second is where the location of your default container within your application. Okay? And that's used, again, when we have not yet downloaded a container from the network. This provides a container holder. The container holder is notified every time a new container gets downloaded from the network. And then in your code, you call getContainer, and that'll return the latest version of the container. Once you have a container, you can then call getString, getBoolean, getInteger, getLong to get values given a key string. And then, of course, you go to work and actually utilize that value. All right. There's more to it than that, though. It's not, so although Tag Manager can be used just to provide global key value pairs, it can be also used more specifically for targeting. Okay. You've heard discussions about segments. We can identify segments, for instance, of high spenders or potential spenders, or people in different languages, people using a particular version of the OS, people using a particular version of your application, and so on. And we can apply custom key values to those using rules from Google Tag Manager. Here, for instance, I'm giving an example of doing translation using GTM. Okay, so what we've set up is, again, these regtext and try-text, which are the specify what the button text should be. And I've set up here Chinese strings. So these are, and they're probably wrong, it's whatever Google Translate said register translates to, okay? So I can't verify their accuracy. But in any case, we're saying we're basically going to use for strings.regtext this 2-character value if Chinese is true. And if we look down at the rule for Chinese, Chinese says that the language starts with ZH. Okay? And that I can attest to is Chinese. So we have a set of predefined macros, including the language, the OS version, the SDK version, which platform, iOS or Android. You can use those as well as other custom macros where you provide the values. So for instance, if you want to be targeting big spenders, you're the one, you know what spend is. And so what you do is write the user spend to the data layer, which is like an in-memory whiteboard of information, meta information about the user. You write it to that, and then you can write rules based on that value. So if you write interesting information to the data layer about the user, how much have they spent, how many times have they run the application, what level are they on, and so on, you can then write powerful rules for targeting for that. We have German set up similarly, and then finally we have default, which of course is English. And here, instead of explicitly saying we're targeting English, we're basically carving out everyone but Chinese and German. And the reason for that, if the user has set up their system to be in Spanish, we want to have some values, and we're going to go ahead and revert to the English values. Okay? But the nice thing is, if we want to start supporting Spanish, we don't redeploy our app. We just go to our container, add a new rule for Spanish. Within the next 12 hours, all the users will be updated, and away we go. So we have this ability now, all right? We can set values dynamically, right? So go up to the website and change them if we want to change them. That's great. And we can do that on a targeted basis. But the question is, what's the best setting to use, right? What's the best setting to use for a particular register button? In order to increase the number of registrations? What's the best setting as far as how often you should present offers to users in order to maximize the in-app revenue? What's the best wording for those offers to increase the revenue? How often can you show ads without affecting engagement? Right? If you show them too often, people may give up. If you don't show them often enough, you're leaving money on the table. And the best way to do this really is, one thing is just guess, right? Try one value, and then later try another value. Has two problems, right? One problem is there might be exogenous factors that are affecting things, right? So it might be that this week you have higher in-app revenue than last week for some outside reason. And the fact that you changed the text of your offer didn't really have anything to do with that. Also, it's slow to be making these serial changes. So what I'm really excited to announce today is experimentation for mobile applications. Okay, for both Android and iOS. Just a little bit of a background. So I came from experimentation on the web for Google Analytics. And when we first started this project of Google Tag Manager for mobile, this was how can we actually get experimentation for mobile applications? Okay? What can we provide? There's nothing like redirecting, for instance, to another URL in apps. And so Google Tag Manager for mobile apps really, in my mind, was a way to get experimentation. It turns out it allows a lot more along the way, but this gets us to a goal I've always wanted. You can run experiments on either all of your users or a targeted subset of users, again, using these rules. When an experiment ends, you can lock in a winning variation. You don't need to change your application. So as long as you're using Google Tag Manager and your application is highly configurable, okay, in the way we've discussed, and also supports Google Analytics, then experimentation just works. Okay? Within Analytics, once you have run an experiment, or as you're running an experiment, you can actually segment your users in the way Mike was describing in the last talk. Except another axis of segmentation you can now do is by experiment and variation. How did people who got exposed to one variation in an experiment, how did they differ on whatever metrics you're interested in looking at versus users who were exposed to a different variation? What I'd like to do now is show you a demo. So I have a game here. All right, in this game, well, it's really not much of a game. Right now it just has the try text and the register text in the way I showed before. But imagine it's a really good game, all right? And what I am interested in doing is modifying the register text. So I can see here this value collection. The value collection, again, is a collection of key value pairs. And I want to be modifying the register text to say something, to try some different values. So I can now create an experiment macro from this collection. Let's kind of look at what I'm going to do. I'll give it a name. It'll be, let's say, the register experiment. In order for experiments to work, you need to be using Google Analytics, right? This completes sort of a round trip where we provide a different variation to each user, but somehow we have to capture that and then see how their behavior is different in the future. And so we capture that by reporting into Google Analytics. So you need to link a particular container with a particular Google Analytics property. We've already done that and set it up on the Acme game property. Properties in Analytics have one or more views. I'm selecting a view. And then here's a key here. When you're experimenting, you're not just randomly experimenting, like, what are all the things that might change if I expose a user to one version of something versus another version of something? But really, you have a particular objective in mind, and that you specify for the experiment. Snehal talked about reporting your transactions and in-app revenue, and here's one important reason, so that you can actually optimize an in-app revenue using experimentation. So you can choose that you'll optimize the in-app revenue, and then we'll determine which variation is better depending on which is giving a higher average in-app revenue. Another thing you experiment on is some form of engagement. How many screens are they going to? How long are their durations? Crashes and exceptions. So part of what GEA provides is the ability to report back crashes and exceptions. You may have a hypothesis, for example, that on this particular device you're seeing a lot of exceptions. Okay? Let's say an OS version. Maybe the problem is that you have a timeout for a network call you're making that's too short. So our hypothesis is that increasing that timeout will reduce the number of crashes. You make an experiment, you make its objective be crashes. You'll be happy to know that when your objective is crashes or exceptions, we actually look to minimize that metric rather than the maximization we do in the other metrics. Okay? As well as the pre-existing metrics on which you can optimize, we also allow you to optimize on your own metrics. So these in Google Analytics are called goals. For a particular view in Google Analytics, you can set up a goal, and that goal can be one of a variety of things. As was discussed in the last session, you can provide an event, which include a category, an action, a label, and a value to Google Analytics, and then set up a goal based on any of the settings of those categories, actions, labels, or values. I have already set up for my Google Analytics view a goal which is registered. So when the user registers in my application, I go ahead and send an event via Analytics. That is what I'm trying to optimize. So I'll clearly be able to see when I change the text of the register button, how does that affect how often the users register. So I've got my original, and this is just the name of the variations. I'm going to name the original register and the variation register now, so that when I'm looking at reports, I can more easily remember what that actually was. And my original is going to provide the register text that just says register. And then my variation, I'm going to modify that. Okay, sorry, this is my variation. This is my original. So let's make the original say register, and the variation say register now. We're not limited to one variation. We can have up to 10 variations we want. I'm going to just limit to this for the moment. For an experiment, there are some advanced options that's worth kind of looking at. You can control what percentage of users get included in the experiment. By default, it's 100%, but you can reduce that to just some small subset if you'd like. A confidence threshold for the statistical significance when we declare a winner. How long the experiment runs. Often, users exhibit some sort of behavior that differs from day to day in the week. So for instance, weekend days may be different from weekdays. We wouldn't run an experiment for just 2 days if that happened to be over the weekend, and then generalize that across an entire week. So by default, we run an experiment for at least 2 weeks. You can reduce that if you want. When the experiment ends, we'll automatically serve the winning variation. So we'll lock in that winning variation, although if you want to just revert back to the original, even if that's not as good as your winning variation, you certainly can. And then finally, we'll add an enabling rule. Remember, this was just for non-Chinese, non-German. So we want to run always except in Chinese and German. Okay, so we've created this experiment. What do we need to do to actually make it work? We create a version, and then we publish that version. When you publish a version, it's going to start an experiment. And so we go ahead and publish it. It starts. What's going to happen now? So once this publishes, as devices check in to receive the latest version of the container, they'll now receive this container that has experiment information in it. When the user when the user sees the buttons, your application will be retrieving the strings.register text. And as it retrieves that, we'll actually do a coin flip to decide which variation they're going to see. They'll see that variation, we'll report that information back to Google Analytics. Anything from then on that gets reported to Google Analytics, that information will be tagged that this user saw this variation of this particular experiment. Okay? And it's also important to know, every time the user comes back, we're not going to reflip that coin. Once they're in an experiment and have been exposed to a particular variation, they stay with that variation so they have a consistent experience. All right, so let us look at this experiment in Google Analytics. So the fact is, since we just started it running, we actually don't have any users that have been providing any information yet. So it's a kind of boring report at this point. But this is where we would see how users are doing, what their conversion rates, and so on. Let me show you a report from another application. So here, you can see our various variations. We see how many visits and conversions for each one, the conversion rate, and then a comparison to the original. Here, variation 1 is doing great compared to the original. So 234% better, almost 2.5 times as good. Its probability of outperforming the original, 100%. Why haven't we ended the experiment yet, though, and declared that a winner? Because we've only actually got 2 days of data, and we still have a chance for perhaps another variation to do better. Or if during the week, variation 1 does really poorly, maybe even the original will catch up. At this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Lucas.
Bill's team did a great job, and it's a really powerful tool. If there are just 3 things I could ask you to walk away remembering, though, they are, well, not necessarily the bullet points on this slide, but more or less, separating configuration from code is really powerful, right? So being able to push new configuration to all of your users at any time without needing to ship a new binary is a really powerful tool. And it can kind of change the way you think about how you can optimize your app and win, and what should be static versus what should be dynamically configurable. And we give you a really powerful rules engine to allow you to control that configuration as well. Beyond that, we didn't show a lot about the Google Tag Manager UI, but we give you a lot of tools to help teams collaborate safely so that you can have multiple people editing rules or configuration in your app, and then have controls, say maybe this person can edit things, but only I am allowed to actually push changes out to my app. And what that does is it kind of unlocks the team. It lets multiple people collaborate. It lets people like marketers and business analysts get their work done without bothering developers. But it still does it in a really safe way that makes sure that you can control who can make changes within your app. And finally, being able to create these experiments, push them, get results, and then lock in a winning variation, all without shipping a new binary, is just an insanely powerful tool. It's really kind of dizzying to think about if you've done a good job of instrumenting your app, right, about the stuff that you care about, the stuff that you think should be configurable, to think about what are the outcomes I want to optimize for, right? What are the variables that might contribute to success or failure against those outcomes? I'm just going to plug those into the experimentation engine and just let it figure out what the right outcome is, right? So being able to just push a new experiment like that at any time is just an insanely powerful tool, and we're really excited to see what people do with it in a mobile app context. So I guess, as no surprise, we're Google, right? We think more data is better and testing beats guessing. And I think, what we've shown you is a tool that kind of unlocks your ability to do that, your ability to conduct measurement, configuration changes, and experimentation. So we're super excited about it. Neil and I will be outside if anybody wants to talk to us right after this talk, and we'll be on the expo floor at our booth on Wednesday and Thursday. So thanks.
One more thing. It is Google. It's free.
Thanks, everybody.